My guest here today, Steve Brusati, who is a graduate student at Columbia University, and his specialty is studying evolution over very, very long scales of time using the geological and fossil record. And Mark Norell, who is the chair of the Division of Paleontology here at the museum. And his specialty is the origin of birds and the dinosaurs that gave rise to them. They are both co-authors of a recent paper on the shapes and the sizes of dinosaurs in the 10 million years before the last mass extinction. Can you tell us why you looked at this period of time?
Well, we're really interested in figuring out how dinosaurs were evolving, how they were changing over those 10 to 12 million years before they ultimately went extinct. And the only way to really do that is to look in detail at their fossil record, at those specimens from all over the world that we have, to quantify what we can say about their trends in evolution. Were they static over that time? Were they plateauing in biodiversity? Were they increasing? Or maybe some of them were undergoing long-term declines, and that may be factored into their final extinction.
And there is a body of research that suggests this, right? That dinosaurs were actually in decline when the asteroid hit and whatever other factors contributed to that.
A lot of that research, though, I mean, it comes in the way in which you count things. And that in the simplest data we have is you just go out in the fossil record and you can see the place where it marks the end of the Mesozoic era, where the asteroid hit, the ash layer. And you can just like look at fossils below that and start counting them up and say, well, 30 feet, which represents X millions of years before the asteroid hit, there's this many fossils we find. And then slightly after that, there's this many fossils and this many fossils. So you come up basically with a numeric value through time, like a timeline of how many things are there. Well, that's the basic data. And you can do that, and if you do that, it does look like things are decreasing. However, that's just the basic data. If you take that data and then you manipulate it a little bit, I mean, you look at it and try to correct for things like sampling and try to correct for just statistical variances in the fossil record, that pattern isn't necessarily there. So it's just ways in which that we analyze the data. And what we did in this paper is we looked at it through a completely different lens, a different way of analyzing it that hadn't been done before.
And so you looked at the diversity in the shape and size of these 7 different groups. What does looking at shape and size tell you that species counts couldn't?
Yeah, what we did in this project is instead of just counting species or individual fossils, as Mark was just describing, we looked instead at the anatomical diversity of dinosaurs, the overall variation in their skeletons over those 10 to 12 million years. And what this basically entails is building very large databases of features of the skeleton, the presence or absence of bones, differences in the size and shapes of bones, evaluating those in a number of species, in this case about 150 different species of dinosaurs living right at the end of the Cretaceous, and just plotting that variability over time. And so there's a couple of plus points to doing this kind of work. First of all, many biological things, whether it's diet, whether it's ecology, body size, are closely tied to anatomy. So it's often been argued that looking at anatomical diversity is a more biologically meaningful way of looking at trends in biodiversity over time, rather than just counting species. And you could think about that. You may have an ecosystem somewhere with 100 different species, but they're all small little rodents that all pretty much look the same. So there's not a great amount of biological diversity there. There could be another ecosystem where you only have 3 species, but you may have a platypus and you may have a bat and you may have a weasel, let's say. So much more biological diversity. And the second real asset to looking at anatomical diversity is it's less biased by these fossil record biases that Mark just mentioned. It's more robust to the reality of the fact that we're never going to have a perfect fossil record.
And lest discussion of biodiversity seem a little too abstract, let me just pull up a picture here of an assemblage of species from the late Cretaceous, which is the time that we're talking about. And so you're looking at this 10 million year window. What did you see? What were the patterns that emerged?
Well, I think that what we saw was that when we analyzed the data with the phylogenies involved, we were actually able to determine that the plant-eating dinosaurs were seeming to show some decline in morphological or anatomical diversity as one approaches the record, while that the carnivorous dinosaurs didn't seem to be showing any decline. Now, there's a lot you could make out of this. I mean, you could make out of, for instance, that carnivorous dinosaurs just eat other dinosaurs, so it didn't really matter. That you could speculate, I wouldn't, but you could speculate that plant-eating dinosaurs are much more sensitive to environmental perturbation because so many animals that are herbivorous today are specialists on just certain kinds of leafy matter and things in their environment, so that they might be more susceptible to change, whereas the carnivores wouldn't.
And the groups that we're talking about, or the shapes that we're talking about going away, the Triceratops, and of course our charismatic fauna of the age of dinosaurs, the Triceratops body plan you were saying is pretty much the only one of the hornbills or the horned dinosaurs that made it through. Why is that? Why would you see that specific decline in North America, correct? Not in Asia.
Right. It's a pretty striking pattern, actually. Triceratops is a member of this group of dinosaurs called the ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs. They have various, horns on their skulls. They have a frill at the back of their skull. So, very distinctive. You can see them in almost any museum. We have a bunch of them on display here. And these animals were doing pretty well in North America for much of the Cretaceous, much of the late Cretaceous. But over that final 10 million years, there was a very stark decline. And the decline is so stark that by the end of the Cretaceous, in those million or 2 years before the asteroid hit, it was pretty much only Triceratops that was left in North America. So I think that really illustrates just how serious that decline was.
And here also is another example of one of the few species to make it through, the hadrosaur. What was happening in North America at this time that would have caused such an ecological disruption?
Well, there's a lot of things going on, not just in North America, but around the entire world during the last few million years before the asteroid hit. For instance, that there was epicontinental seaways, these big oceans that bisected the North American and the Asian continent. They disappeared. There was also huge volcanic events that were going on in India that were injecting phenomenal amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. And these weren't just the kind of volcanic events that just happen and then they go away, the Mount St. Helens event and things like that. These were events that took place over several millions of years, and that they were so large. They're the second largest volcanic events that we know about. If you would have spread the Deccan lavas across the entire planet, they would cover the entire planet to a depth of about 3 feet. So these are big events.
Wow.
And you just can imagine the amount of CO2 and other gases that would be injected in the environment. And also that this thing about the epicontinental seas is a big thing because, as we were discussing earlier, is that that being close to an ocean really affects your climate. New York, Minneapolis, and Seattle are at nearly the same latitude, but New York and Seattle have livable climates compared to Minneapolis because it's not buffered by the oceans and it's in the middle of the continent. So if your continent is bisected by these big oceans, there's going to be a lot more area that's on the periphery of these oceans, which will be rather equable compared to the center of continents.
And this image for all you out there shows the Western Interior Waterway at 75 and 100 million years ago. And it just lets you see, what sort of radical changes were really occurring in a geologically very short period of time that, could have had such an impact on these creatures. And so it seems that one of the big takeaways from this is that the age of dinosaurs, even this period in it, that we always tend to think of as kind of a homogeneous entity and a static thing, was very dynamic.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, and I would agree. I think that's probably the single take-home message here. Maybe the asteroid did, kill off the dinosaurs. Maybe that was the sole reason. But at the very least, we can say that asteroid, and the volcanism as well, or any other event that may have occurred at the end of the Cretaceous, it didn't hit a static, unchanging, lost world. This was a time, 10 million year time, that dinosaurs were changing quite dramatically. And some groups of dinosaurs were stable, other groups were declining. Dinosaurs in some parts of the world, like North America, at least some groups were in decline, whereas those same groups in other continents, like Asia, seem to have actually been increasing. So this was a time, the evolution of dinosaurs during this time wasn't simple. So when that asteroid hit, it hit a world that was in flux, that was changing.
And the beginning of the mass extinction is a good moment to begin our question and answer session. If there's anybody out there in the audience, please step up to the microphone and ask if you have a question. And, sir.
I've been fascinated by all of your work, Mark, and all your students' work. I'm Dr. Silver from St. Louis, and I heard about this, and I knew I had to come. You know, we talked a long time ago about a wild speculation that I had. I'm not a paleontologist, more of a doctor and a molecular biologist. A wild speculation that maybe there was a skewed sex ratio related to the lack of, perhaps there was a skewed sex ratio related to the lack of genetic sex determination. It's a speculation. But I'm wondering, since you have this tremendous trove of specimens that go from the last 10 million years to 65 million years ago, is there a way you could sex these specimens to see if there was any change in the sex ratio?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's something that we and other groups have been working on for a long time. And one of the ways in which we've attempted to do it, it hasn't worked so well yet, but I think that it has the possibility of working, is that if you can think about modern birds, which are a kind of dinosaur, and you think about their eggshells. I mean, if their eggshells have a huge amount of calcium in them, and if you think about mobilizing that much calcium in a body to make an eggshell that is can be several grams of calcium, that is really, really, really hard. And birds do it novelly by their bone ends in their joints, the area, the cartilaginous part, the epiphysis. So you don't eat a chicken bone, it's that part that pulls off at the end of the bone. They actually store calcium. Female birds store calcium in that area of the bone and then mobilize that calcium to build eggshell during the breeding season. So if you do histology on those, which means that you take like a really small section and then grind it really flat and you look at it under a microscope, is that the cellular matrix of a female bird in those bones is very different than a male bird's. And we can identify that in living animals. Now, we've tried to do that with a little bit of success, but not statistical success, in non-avian dinosaurs. So I think that eventually we'll get better at it, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. But it is one of the things that we are looking at.
Thank you, thanks.
Oh, well, someday we'll be able to tell if life was hard for the single dinosaur. What about, I know there's a question that was asked here, and I have lost it. However, it was about, it was from Greg in Florida saying there has been mainstream media coverage lately of prehistoric fleas and other parasites possibly contributing to dinosaur extinction. Do you think this is a viable claim, at least for some of the North American species declines?
You want to handle that one, Mark?
No. I mean, certainly, parasitic arthropods have a very deep history within the Mesozoic period. And also, one of the things that people really got to get around is that, you had it up there earlier, the picture of the Cretaceous forest, that dinosaurs aren't these big scaly things anymore. That we know Tyrannosaurus rex had feathers. And birds are more closely related to Tyrannosaurus rex than just about any dinosaur most of the people in this room have ever heard of. So there's a lot of evidence even that feathers or feather-like structures are primitive for dinosaurs in general, so that they were all feathered at some point in their lives, or at least primitively feathered. So the whole idea that dinosaurs went extinct is really a misnomer, because is that living birds have much more to do with Tyrannosaurus rex, and Tyrannosaurus rex has to do with that little Ankylosaur there, these dinosaurs over here, and things like that. So that some dinosaurs went extinct. It would be the same thing like saying that if humans were good enough at exterminating all the other primates on the planet, would primates be extinct? And we would say, no, we're primates. So dinosaurs are birds.
And what about another study that's been in the news quite a bit lately, and Zachary via email brought it up here, the hypothesis that dinosaur flatulation, particularly the large sauropods, caused climate change, could that have happened? B, could it have led to the decline that you saw in the paper?
I know Mark's bursting to answer this one.
I love this one. This is really, really bad science. It's,
but it is poetic. It's so poetic.
But it's really bad science. To do this, these guys, who, I don't know if anybody saw my comments in the Wall Street Journal, they actually admitted that it wasn't very good. But it was there's an equation that would estimate that how much methane would be produced from a dinosaur. Well, that equation has a lot of different parameters in it. It has things like effective herd size, body mass of the animal, how efficient the microbes would be in fermenting, how much the animal had to eat each day, the caloric value of what the animal was eating as far as fermentable materials. So there's about 7 different variables that they had in this equation, all multiplied by one another. Well, each of those variables that they differ in most cases by at least 1 order of magnitude and at least 3 orders of magnitude as far as the paleontologist's best estimates, depending on the paleontologist, of what those variables would be. So you multiply these all by one another. You're just compounding all those variances. So you come up with an answer, which means nothing.
But it is mediogenic. We have a question right here.
Robert Backer has talked about the evolution of plants driving the evolution of dinosaurs and the lack of biodiversity at the end of Cretaceous being contributed by plants. And Mike Novacek, who I believe you guys know, in his book Terra, related the 5 great mass extinctions to the big mass extinction going on now. I wonder if you could comment on those.
Yeah, about the issue of dinosaurs and plants. So during the Cretaceous, during the heyday of the dinosaurs, this is when flowering plants first evolved. So even many of today's familiar groups of flowering plants evolved at this time. So it's long been thought by Bakker and others that there may have been some kind of coevolutionary race between some dinosaurs, especially these large plant eaters like the duck-billed dinosaurs and the horned dinosaurs, and plants. But people have started to dive into this very finely using the fossil record and compiling diversity curves of plants, comparing those to diversity curves of dinosaurs. And it doesn't really look like there's any clear picture there. It's not like new groups of dinosaurs immediately begin to evolve in concert with or soon after the origin of flowering plants, or that other groups go extinct at that time. So undoubtedly, the evolution of flowering plants and the spread of flowering plants would have had an effect on dinosaurs, but I don't think it had anything to do with their extinction, and it doesn't seem like it was any sort of major driver of their overall evolutionary patterns.
And some of the ways we look at flowering plants has really changed. I mean, the old story, when Bakker wrote that, for instance, is flowering plants were largely phenomena of the late Cretaceous. And now that flowering plants are pushed way back to minimally the early Cretaceous and probably even before that.
What about the great extinction we're going through now, comparing it to KT?
It's really hard because these are vast differences in time and scale. I mean, we look at the late Cretaceous extinction. If we say that it wasn't instantaneous, is that in fact that the whole world was changing dramatically. We're looking at time frames of 10 to 15 million years, whereas we're looking at 2 lifetimes now. So it's because the temporal scales are so different, it's very difficult to compare them.
And we also have a question from Blessing on Twitter, which is that it appears you actually saw a slight increase in the morphological diversity of the billed dinosaurs in Asia. Why might that have been going up?
Yeah, so that's one of the other interesting patterns that we found, is that there may have been some geographic differences in what dinosaurs were doing in terms of their evolution during those final 10 million years of the Cretaceous. And one of our biggest issues is that we have a pretty good fossil record of dinosaurs from North America, from places out west like Montana and Wyoming. We have historically some of the best records of any dinosaurs from any time right at the end of the Cretaceous in those parts of the world. But we don't know a whole lot about what dinosaurs were doing in other parts of the world at that time. Now, over the past couple of decades, largely due to the work of Mark and many of his colleagues in China, we've learned a lot more about what dinosaurs were doing in Asia. The number of new Asian dinosaurs, both from the end of the Cretaceous, but really from throughout the age of dinosaurs, has just exponentially exploded. And now we have sample sizes that are decent enough that we can look at the trends in their evolution over the final part of the Cretaceous. And it does seem like these duck-billed dinosaurs in North America very clearly undergoing a huge decline, but in Asia, they were increasing in their anatomical diversity over this time. And I don't know exactly why that might be. I don't know. Mark may have some idea on this, but it's a pattern we see, and I think we still need to explain it.
And I'm not completely convinced that the Asian pattern is necessarily correct, because one of the things that we have in North America, because of, we can really accurately date the faunas in the rocks using, using radioactivity and things like that. So we're able to do that with a very high degree of precision in North America. Unfortunately, we don't have that same sort of dating control yet on the Asian faunas. So we can't, we can tell time in the kind of under $500,000 or 500,000 year, 500,000 year level in North America. In Asia, we're talking more about a couple million years as far as our confidence of how old these things are. So just slight differences in that can make a big difference.
It's really amazing listening to you both how the sense comes through that you are really looking through the geological keyhole at, 135 million year span, and to be able to, obviously there's still so many questions left, but to have such a fine-grained appreciation of it at this distance is just
well, it's hard
really
too,
amazing.
though, because just the record is not very good. I mean, it's one of the things that people, they come to a museum like this one, or that they read a dinosaur book and they say, wow, there's lots of different kinds of dinosaurs. Well, the first dinosaurs appear about 235 million years ago. The last of the non-avian dinosaurs disappear about 65 million years ago. So, we have about 170 million years or so of time which these animals lived in. During that 170 million years, there's only about 1,300 dinosaurs that have been named. And of those 1,300 that have been named, about half of those are known from unique specimens. So that if you compare that today, that there's about amniotes, which is basically turtles, reptiles, birds, and ourselves. There's about 22,000 that are occupying the planet today, just in one instance. So you can just see how poor the record really is.
And when you say unique fossil, you mean there's one of them.
There's one specimen. And
Which
sometimes
usually
not
is a
a very
couple
good
of bones.
specimen.
Yeah, usually a tooth and a...
Yeah.
What you mentioned the very beginning of the dinosaur age. Can you talk a little bit more? I mean, everyone always talks about how did it come to an end? How did it start?
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. This is another big part of the research that we do here. So dinosaurs, as Mark mentioned, originated somewhere around 235 million years ago. Those are the oldest fossils of dinosaurs that we have. We have fossils of very close relatives of dinosaurs, things that are right on a couple of the twigs, right outside dinosaurs on the family tree of life, that are from about 250 million years ago. And this was only 1 or 2 million years after a mass extinction at the end of the Permian, which was the largest mass extinction of all time. So at a time where maybe up to 95% of all species went extinct. So in the aftermath of that terrible, destructive event, that's where we see the root of dinosaurs, and also of other groups like crocodiles and mammals and turtles. You have many major groups that originated and began to radiate out at that time. And so what it looks like is that the rise of dinosaurs was something that was intimately tied to that mass extinction, but is also something that didn't happen very quickly. It was a complex event. It happened over the course of 50 million years. Over that time, dinosaurs were living alongside many other groups of land-living vertebrates, including many close relatives of crocodiles that were very similar to dinosaurs, convergent on each other in many different ways. And in fact, the crocodile-like animals were a lot more diverse than dinosaurs in terms of their anatomy and also in terms of their number of species. But the crocodile animals were hit hard by another mass extinction right at the end of the Triassic period, about 200 million years ago. Dinosaurs, for some reason, were able to sail through that pretty unscathed, and we don't know why. This is one of the great mysteries we still have. People speculate it may have something to do with the fact that dinosaurs grew faster or breathed more efficiently or had a higher metabolism, but these are very hard things to test in the fossil record. But what we do know is that other groups of vertebrates, especially crocodiles and their close relatives, were hammered by this second mass extinction. Dinosaurs made it through. And then in the aftermath of that extinction, in the Jurassic period, is when you start to see dinosaurs become truly dominant. You see dinosaurs evolve huge size. You see the various groups of dinosaurs, the carnivorous dinosaurs, the long-necked dinosaurs, spread all around the world. And this is really when the age of dinosaur dominance kicks in, that age that we all think of when we see Jurassic Park or see a mural of dinosaurs.
I think it's interesting to point out, too, that the Permo-Triassic extinction, the largest extinction ever, as Steve said, as well as the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, there's no evidence for an extraterrestrial impact at all for those. So that it's...
But volcanism, major volcanism in both of those times.
There's a big major volcanism both of those times. But that's not to say that the asteroid, off Chicxulub didn't happen or wasn't involved in some of it, but it doesn't seem to be a general pattern that these extraterrestrial hits are driving the biggest extinctions.
So when you're living on a planet with a molten core, every now and then it
Yeah,
spills over.
exactly.
From Bruce on Facebook, there is a much higher proportion of plant-eating animals relative to predator animals. Therefore, you would likely find fewer predator dinosaurs no matter what. How can you tell that predators were not declining as much as their prey, given that you had a smaller sample size to judge from?
Well, that's true. If you go to most ecosystems, there's going to be a lot more plant eaters than there are meat eaters. Plant eaters are, more towards the bottom of the food chain. Meat eaters more towards the top. And of course, you kind of truncate the number of individuals as you go up the food chain. But in terms of this study, our sample of predators really isn't worse than our sample of the plant eaters. We had, I can't remember off the top of my head, but a good number, 30 or 40 species of different carnivorous dinosaurs that we analyzed. And so the sample size is good. The other thing is that the methods we used, they can take into account differences in sample sizes between comparisons. We don't just calculate a number. This group was this diverse in terms of their anatomy, but we do various statistical tests that simulate what happens if you don't sample certain ones or if you sample other ones, and that puts error bars on our measurements. So I think we can be pretty confident in that way that at least based on what we know of the fossil record, of our pretty good fossil record of carnivorous dinosaurs in North America and in Asia at the very least, is that they were pretty stable over those 10 million years.
I think some of it also is just this misunderstanding of what diversity is, because that there's kind of three meanings for it. One is abundance, just the total number of animals, even of the same species, that are there. Second is the number of kinds of species that are there, or the absolute morphological diversity. Because if you look at mammals, for an example, that a huge fraction of living mammals are made up of bats. But you look at a bat, it looks pretty much the same as another bat, for the most part.
Apologies to all the bat researchers out there in the audience.
But nevertheless, people will recognize it as a bat. You look at some other animal groups, some marsupials are a good example. They go all the way from, wombats to tree kangaroos to possums. So that there's that kind of diversity, and that's the kind of diversity that we're looking at in this study. So it's not just that, there's a lot of Edmontosaurus right before the boundary, like we find thousands of fossils of it. We don't need thousands of fossils. We need one good fossil for each of the different taxa, and then we're able to calculate the morphological diversity from it.
And there's a couple people who have asked online, what was it about Triceratops that made it so special and able to get through this decline?
Beats me. Everybody seems to love Triceratops. I don't know. I don't know.
It's like cockroaches. They go through anything. So.
Big, charismatic cockroaches.
Yeah.
I believe that
We have a
does
question
it.
here in the audience.
Oh,
in the
I'm
audience.
very sorry, sir. Question.
Hi, thank you for coming today and talking. I want to ask you about your research, specifically what you've been doing lately. You mentioned that you've been researching the last 10 to 12 million years of dinosaur biodiversity, and you cited that herbivores seem to have declined at a certain amount at that time. I'm wondering, that amount of activity in terms of biodiversity, was it common in other time periods? Was it rare? Was it unique? And if you explored this in other time periods, would you find the same kind of results, do you think?
Well, I think you're not going to find the same results. You're going to find dynamics in the same kind of way, of different groups increasing in all kinds of diversity, whether it's species diversity or morphologic diversity, and some groups declining. It just hasn't been looked at yet. So this is really the first sort of stage of it. I mean, that's what Steve's going to spend his career on.
I need a job first, so any potential employers out there online. I'll just, maybe that's not the best thing, any employers online. The thing I'll add to that is we've kind of started to work backwards, going, starting at the extinction of the dinosaurs and working back in time. And so ultimately, we'd love to have these curves, these evolutionary curves of diversity covering the entire period of the age of dinosaurs. And we'll get there eventually. But when you just count up species, that's pretty straightforward to do. It would take about a day to just sit down there's online databases of dinosaur species, and it would just take about a day to sit down and compile how the number of species changed over time. But to build these big data sets, to quantify the skeletal anatomy of every species and analyze that statistically, that's something that really will take years and years and years. So we're starting to build that, and I'm pretty confident that within the next decade we'll get farther and farther along and have curves of morphological diversity for dinosaurs across the whole Mesozoic, and then we can answer that question. Is this decline among these plant eaters at the end of the Cretaceous, is that abnormal? Or were there other declines like that throughout the age of dinosaurs that dinosaurs recovered from? And having that context will allow us to, I think, much better tackle this question of did that decline at the end of the Cretaceous have anything to do with their ultimate extinction, or was it just background noise?
And also, to add what Steve said is that you'd think that making one of these charts of sort of number of dinosaurs and then time on the other axis, and you see stuff going up and going down and going, that would mean something. It doesn't, just on the basic data. Simply because that you cannot distinguish between time periods. We'll say you find a time period that has hardly any dinosaurs at all. Okay, well, you can't distinguish between finding very few dinosaurs and finding very few fossils, because there's some time periods that are just black holes. I mean, that there are places where there's no rocks on the planet for that particular time period which preserve dinosaur fossils that exist. So, it doesn't mean there weren't any dinosaurs. It just means we don't have any rocks or any fossils that show that they were there. So,
Thank you.
That was an excellent question. Life tapestry, it is rich and ever shifting. Very good question from Sam via email. What were the first dinosaurs to fly? And were they big or small?
that's an area of contention right now. Not the big small thing. Small, definitely. I mean, if you look at sort of the, you do a size analysis, a least squares analysis of sizes of the trunk of the theropod dinosaur family tree that goes up toward birds, you see this progressive decrease in the size of animals. I mean, we actually have a paper coming out on that in a couple weeks about pedomorphic dinosaurs and size change and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, is what were the first things to fly is something that our lab's very interested in and other labs are very interested in. And it's a tough question. I mean, first, what do you mean by flying? Because if you call flying the kind of flight that we see in modern birds, where it's true powered flight, that's not what existed in Archaeopteryx, which everybody says could fly and is considered to be the most primitive bird. I mean, Archaeopteryx does not have the same sort of type of flight or flight capability that a pigeon has. And moving beyond Archaeopteryx to the things that are outside of the classic birds, to the non-avian dinosaurs, we see a lot of things that seem to suggest what we call volant activity, meaning that they have wing-like structures on their forelimbs. The feathers on those structures tend to be asymmetrical in the same way that the flight feathers of modern birds are. And we see things like wishbones. We see a lot of these other kinds of things in these animals. Now, my own take on it is that these things may have had some gliding or parachuting capability. In no way did they have the type of musculature which would have allowed powered flight like we see in a modern bird. So
before you can fly, you need to fall a little bit less worse.
Yeah, but that's also been an argument too of whether that flight originated from gliding from the trees down, or that flight originated from cursorial animals that were chasing things and stuff, and it was just a much better sort of locomotory strategy to be able to hop, skip, and jump over long stretches. So I think that it's still out there, but again, just calling it flight and non-flight is kind of like one of these straw man arguments, because there's a progression of things in between things that are totally terrestrial and things that are the powered flyers that we see today, which is a number of stages.
And Archaeopteryx, I know that its position in the tree of flight has been debated quite a bit. It is still considered a proto-bird?
I think that, it depends on what you define birds as. 20 years ago, if you would have asked that question to a group of paleontologists, everybody would have said, oh, Archaeopteryx, it's the first bird, But now that, especially with all the specimens coming out of northeastern China, that some are established well within the family tree of birds, others are outside the family tree of birds. And even a lot of the things that people would traditionally use to define birds in the olden days, like hollow bones and like feathers, wishbones, breastbones, now we know that those went way deep in the family tree, way outside. Tyrannosaurus had all of those things. So that defining just what is a bird and what isn't a bird, because unlike mammal, the term bird has never been given any formal scientific meaning. So nobody's ever some people would say, well, a bird is Archaeopteryx and pigeons and all of its descendants. Other people would say, well, up until quite recently, they would have said birds have feathers. So it's never been, something which people have agreed upon and pointed to one, as we say, node, which is one connection on the family tree, and said, okay, everything that's descended from this common ancestor, we're going to call a mammal. Like we've done that for mammals. We've done that for reptiles. We've done that for the group to which crocodiles and dinosaurs belong to, called archosaurs. It just was never done for birds for some reason.
And as you were saying earlier, birds are dinosaurs.
Yeah.
If you want to see a dinosaur, go bird watching and just imagine that you're really, really small. It's
Well, that's also a misnomer, I think, too, because is that, just like that, if you go to East Africa today, right, and you just landed on the ground, you say, wow, all mammals are big. But if you intensively sampled it, you would find out that there's a huge diversity of smaller animals as well. And some of this is just symptomatic of 19th century and early 20th century dinosaur collectors. They would go out, they'd want to populate the dinosaur halls like these at this museum with really great specimens. So they'd collect the big ones, and they wouldn't collect the small ones. There's also preservational things that tend to favor the preservation of large animals as opposed to small animals as well. So that as we've sort of discovered more and started intensively what we call micro-sampling, which is digging up a bunch of dirt about the size of this stage and then putting it through sieves to pick out like little teeth and things like that, we find that there was an extensive fauna of dinosaurs that were just small animals, but their bones were just so fragile that rarely do we ever find them as fossils. And that's one of the things that's made the Liaoning deposits in northeastern China so incredibly interesting, because is that everything that comes out of there is small pretty much. And that's because most of these animals were buried extraordinarily quickly by volcanic events, and they were just they didn't really have a chance to be scavenged or decomposed. They were just covered and buried, and 99% of the things you find there are less than a meter long.
Well, if there's not any more questions from the audience, we will end with a question from @officialBLLR on Twitter, which is, other than learning that T-Rex really hates tourists, what is the single biggest dino discovery in the past 20 years?
This.
So Mark's going to retire now, and I'm going to slide over and take his job. I don't know. I mean, you've been in the game for 20 years.
I probably think it's that the work in northeastern China. I mean, it's just there's just been, I mean, even if, we quit collecting, no, I say we, I mean the greater we. I mean, everybody from that Chinese paleontologists, Western paleontologists to farmers out there. And so quit collecting those fossils today, there would still be so much to work on from there for the next 50 years. We'd still be trying to figure it out, because it's really dramatically changed the way that we look at the whole transition to birds, as well as it's provided us with a wealth of new material to apply new technologies to, as far as paleoclimate stuff, diet stuff, and not just for theropod dinosaurs, but for all the other groups of dinosaurs as well. So, I mean, it's just, that really, really unexpected.
Why are those deposits just being unearthed now? Why weren't they found 100 years ago?
They were actually. I mean, that they were known to preserve fossil fishes and things in imperial times. But it's only been during the occupation of Manchuria, the Japanese paleontologists worked there and collected a number of things. But they didn't find any birds, and they didn't find any feathered dinosaurs. I think that largely my own perspective on it is that's happened, with the kind of, rise of China as an economic powerhouse. I mean, where there's been more there's been, world-class institutes built in China now and stuff to study paleontology. There's a huge amount of interest and even pride in China and stuff about the fossils that are found there. It's also fueled by the commercial values of some of these things, is that most of the specimens are still collected not by professional paleontologists, but by farmers. And it is a very poor area of China, and someone finds one really good fossil, they can sell it if it's sold legally inside of China to an institution there, I mean, it can go for a lot of money, and it's like winning the lottery or something. So it's that's driving it. So that there's a number of factors that are involved, but nevertheless, every email I get or from my colleagues, or every time I go, I just see so many new and unbelievable things.
And I know maybe it's superficial to focus on the feathers, but just at least for myself, knowing that all the books that I grew up with need to be redrawn.
Yeah, well, not only the books, but I mean, you can even track it in popular culture by looking at the Jurassic Park films. I mean, if you remember the first one, Velociraptor was scaly like an alligator, and I mean, now that they're completely feathered.
We'll need a director's cut of that with feathers. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you out there in Internet land for attending today. Again, Steve Brusatte,
Thank
Mark
you.
Norell, and I'm Brandon Keim from Wired Science.